chance for some energizer. And let's continue with the second part of the presentations and the second part of our online international conference. And just before I will introduce our next speaker, István has already mentioned, but I would like to mention once again that we are grateful for our supporters, the US Embassy in Budapest and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, who made this conference possible. And with their generous support, we can publish an edited volume in the upcoming months. So thank you for their support. And those who are here with us, thank you for joining us today. I assume that more and more participants will join us from the other side of the Atlantic, from the United States. Let's continue with the second part of the presentations. Just as before, all of our speakers has 30 minutes together. If the presentation is a bit shorter, then we can do a Q&A. So I encourage all of you to use the chat box or the raise your hand function in order to ask your questions. And let's continue with Louisa Slavkova, who is the co-founder and the managing partner, the CIVICS Innovation Hub, and she's also the advisory board member of the European Network for Civic Education. Since 2013, she's founder and the executive director of the Sofia Platform Foundation based in Bulgaria, which is a non-governmental organization working in the field of historical and civic education. She is an author and editor of several books and publications, especially on foreign policy, democracy development, and civic education. Louisa is the co-author of a textbook on civic education in Bulgaria. So not surprisingly, the title of her presentation is The Future of the European Union and the Participation of Citizens. So the virtual floor is yours, and altogether you have 30 minutes. Thank you for joining us today.
Great, Eric. Thank you so much. Just to see how the quality is working of the sound, is that okay? You can hear me good? Okay, great. Thank you. So hi, everyone. Just to say that I would love to see more faces. So if cameras are off, just would be nice to see who else is in the room and wants to engage. Hi, Andre. Great. Hi, everyone. I have prepared a short, I've prepared a short PowerPoint presentation just to help us, go through the conversation, because I know it can be quite challenging to, to follow on someone's input without actually looking at something. So just share it in the middle.
Actually, right now you are one of the hosts of this Zoom event. So now you can use the share your screen function.
Perfect. So in case I don't like someone's question, I can directly mute them, right? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. All the rights is on your side.
Okay. Just to see how this works, I sometimes have problems with PowerPoint, but this is the digital live. Can you see that? Okay, great. So let's see if also, okay. So I've tried to structure this a little bit, and I haven't timed it, so I'm not sure if I need 10 minutes or a little bit more. But I hope I'll be done in less than 15, so we have a little bit of time to discuss. So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, especially to István, and also thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to discuss a little bit civic education and then especially civic participation on the fringes of Europe. So the way I've structured my input today looks into three directions. On the one hand, I want to talk about participation in Europe beyond the capitals. I want us to look into areas that literature is calling civic deserts. These are usually peripheral parts of nation states where participation is very different from participation in capitals. Then I want us to look a little bit on data that is available locally and why the lack of locally available data, especially on civic competences, makes it very difficult to actually design policies or activities that want to boost participation locally. And then the third section of my input focuses on why civic education is the cure for all of this. But joke aside, why and what kind of additional work or studies we should be doing in the field of civic education to understand what else we could be doing in order to boost that. And then we're moving over to a Q&A. So just as it always happens, I keep having challenges in changing the slides of a presentation. So try to see how to do this better. Sorry, I had to just stop sharing, but I'll go back to and maybe I just keep it like this because I think this way it will be a little bit easier, but you still can see it, right? Okay. So a couple of years ago, colleagues and I have started paying attention to electoral maps across Europe, especially Central and Eastern Europe. And the one thing that we noticed is that capitals vote very differently compared to the rest of the countries. And so even though we're practitioners and we have been working on the ground outside of capitals, in civil society, we kept asking ourselves, what is the reason for this difference in voter behavior? And in the research phase, we stumbled upon a terminology that was coined at MIT, and namely this is civic deserts. So in the research that has been done mainly in the Midwest in the United States, civic deserts have been described as areas with perceived lack of opportunities to participate in civic life. And this lack of opportunities to participate in civic life in the American context have been framed as places where basically forms of participation have started to disappear for one or another reason, like, for example, local newspapers, churches, local parties' offices, trade unions, etc. And so while these opportunities have disappeared, they, in their function, haven't been replaced so quickly by new forms of participation. And so this doesn't mean that there aren't, other forms of participation, like, for example, the whole online world, but the functions that these old forms of engagement offered haven't been replaced yet by new other forms like that. And so when it comes to the functions, the research from the US pointed to the fact that they have been, these older forms of engagement have been able to reach a large number of people. They have been able to bring people with different views, or that the reason to bring people together has been different than civic engagement, but at the end of the day, they have been able to boost civic engagement. And so when we started to look for the peripheries or the civic deserts of Europe, we found out a couple of things. On the one hand, these are, as I said, usually areas that are outside the big cities. In especially in centralized countries, this is quite often centralized in small or mid-sized countries. This is very often everything else beyond the capital. I mean, there are Hungarian colleagues in the room who know that, for example, Budapest is 1 million and something, and the next biggest city in the country is 300,000. So this already tells you a lot about the discrepancy between capitals and the rest of the country. So usually these areas called civic deserts in Europe are depopulated with fewer young people, and obviously have also aging population there. Sometimes they're close to so-called magnet cities. Magnet cities meaning that they attract people and people reallocate there rather than to commute, because oftentimes the physical infrastructure is not really good. These areas are oftentimes also deprived of economic opportunities. This is one of the reasons why also people are leaving them in the first place. They are oftentimes close to border, either historical imperial borders or just peripheral regions. And these are also sometimes, especially when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, areas that have undergone transition, severe transition and transformation economically in the 90s after the fall of communism. But the key characteristics of the civic deserts we, in the research, or rather I should say mapping, discovered are two things. The one is the low civic literacy of the local population. Citizens in these areas do not perceive themselves as citizens at all. They perceive themselves as exogenous to the state. So the state is there, I'm here, and we're two different things. And there is a great sense of, of very low self-efficacy. So people do not really see that they can contribute in any way to civic life. So apart from the low civic literacy, which has also a lot of other components when we untangle the whole competences butterfly that I have put a small snapshot of on this slide, there is a very poor civic infrastructure. And this goes in two directions. The one is the sheer lack of civic spaces. They have either disappeared over time, similar to what I gave as an example in the US, or they have never been there in the first place. So there's never been a community space or community center or small cultural center, a place where people would come together, or these places just start disappearing for a variety of reasons. And so the places where people would have the opportunity to come together basically disappear. But the second aspect of the poor civic infrastructure is directed very much to the state of civil society locally. Very often in our region, what you have outside the big cities is organizations that turn into social service providers. But this puts them also in a very different relationship to the local government, because they then receive funding from the local governments to basically do what the state is not able to do, so deliver social services, but they're not necessarily mission-based in this classical civic sense. But the other thing is that they are, if there are organizations that are mission-driven, they're either severely underfunded or understaffed, or lack a plethora of other competences like, how to communicate, how to build an advocacy strategy, how to network, how to build programs that are sustainable, how to really, not just do activities for the sake of the activities, but really be, oriented around the impact and what is mostly needed, etc., etc. And so, by talking about this, I just want to point your attention to the fact that civic participation in general is not what we get to learn from the situations in the capital. So we need to be paying more and more attention to what is going on outside of capitals, so that both civil societies organizations are better supported in their work, especially with what they need in terms of capacities. But this other thing that I want to highlight is the civic literacy element, and the fact that citizens outside of big cities need even more efforts to kind of to try to boost their sense of being citizens. Because if it comes more naturally to people in bigger cities to participate and engage in all different forms, from protests to petitions, on the local level, not only people do not know these different forms of participation, but they also don't feel like it is their job to do them. So this is the one aspect / call of my presentation. And here, one more slide just to say what the difference is between civil society locally and civil society in the big cities. Now, in the research in civic deserts, the other thing we obviously stumbled upon is the lack of data. So you do find, when it comes to civic competences, the very few resources you have at hand are the European Values Survey that is done only, it's a longitudinal study, it's done only every 5 years. It is only in the last couple of years that we have started seeing different instruments, and I believe you also had today with you Oana Popescu, who has recently, with a team of colleagues in Romania, developed a Democracy Resilience Index, which is similar to an endeavor that we have undertaken in Bulgaria to try to understand better the civic health of citizens. So we piloted a civic health index that is quite a mammoth instrument. It has 5 different components, each of them with subcomponents, and then also different target groups, in an attempt to understand what is the problem when it comes to civic participation. is it the lack of trust? Where does the lack of trust come from? Is it coming from, you know, all the historical memories of communism and the inherited kind of attitudes, or the state will do it for me? Does it have to do something with contemporary challenges to democracy? Does it have to do something with the way institutions function? Does it have to do with the low civic competences? Does it have to do with the fact whether I'm living in a big city or not? So what is the, you know, what is the reason for that? And of course, there is no one answer. It very much depends on a lot of different variables. So we're currently in the process of calculating this, and I'll be glad to, you know, extend an invitation to the launch of the index later in October this year. But it did show us, on the one hand, how, you know, how multifaceted the question of participation is, but at the same time also how understudied it is. So there is a great added value to, you know, to start looking into local data about civic participation and civic competences. But then when we speak of local, not only look into, you know, national context, but really try to zoom in regions or municipalities if and resources are available. And this is, you know, always a plea on my end ever since I work on this matter, to say we need to start investing resources to be learning about civic competences on the local level. So this pilot civic health index we are doing in Bulgaria, we are making two pilots. The one is focused on, so the one is nationally representative, so it's covering the whole Bulgaria. But the other one, it took under the, you know, zoomed in one municipality that is in the poorest NUTS2 region in Europe, which is the northwest of Bulgaria, just to see how different is that actually from the national sample, and what can we learn, and how can we translate this into specific measures for that region? Because all the, you know, the key characteristics that I described in the beginning of the presentations about these so-called civic deserts do meet the, you know, the description of this area. So we want to see how specifically do civic competences look like in this one municipality. And the third aspect that I wanted to, you know, the second one is obviously local data is important when it comes to civic competences. And the third aspect of my input today is focusing on the importance of civic education. And so if we think of our states as this, you know, the triangle of the interplay between institutions, elites, and citizens, my assumption has always been that in Central and Eastern Europe, and, you know, since you know, since the beginning of the 90s, there has been a good chunk of focus and work done to you know, to kind of to work with the new elites, to, you know, to focus on democratic elites and sort of to empower them, but also to refurbish institutions and to make sure that they become more democratic and abide the rule of law. But what I keep finding, you know, confirmed in my work on the ground is that the focus on basically getting citizens to understand what a democracy and what participation is has been lagging behind. So if you, like me, are into civic education and you want to do either formal, you know, work with schools, or non-formal outside of school, or informal within any other context where adult learning is happening, you're not going to find many, you know, many calls for projects to develop some work with civic education. There is an active citizenship, etc., and you can argue whether, you know, civic education is something you find within active citizenship or not. But what I'm trying to say is that I think we have missed an opportunity to focus more strongly on basically making sure that our democracies also have enough Democrats to you know, to defend them, but also to participate in them. Because as we know, a democracy doesn't live without Democrats.
Sorry for the interruption. Just the time passes so fast. So can you just conclude your presentation, if it's possible, in a few minutes? Thank you. Sorry.
So my final two words are basically focused on a project that my colleagues and I are currently developing, where we're trying to understand first and foremost, if we want to make sure that we want to boost civic education, who are civic educators in the first place in Europe, and who are the civic educators of the 21st century? Are these the social influencers? Are these teachers? And are there any differences depending on where exactly you're in right now? And so it's in a way an attempt to first figure out who are these individuals, how do they understand civic education, what means do they work with, in order for us then to bring them on a actual virtual map where there is a greater visibility, but also an attempt for us to work with the data that we find out, as I said again, in terms of needs and assets, but also how they approach all that in order to boost participation. And so if I'm to sum up future of participation in the European Union, my three takes are, first of all, do pay attention. Let's pay attention to the local level, because participation there is different from how we understand participation when it comes to political, and voting, but also when it comes to participation in capitals, which I think is a little bit easier because of the better civic infrastructure and the higher civic literacy of citizens in the capitals. The second one is let's advocate for more locally available data, because this helps us really tailor activities, but also understand what are problems and impediments to civic participation outside of big cities. And the third one is to really highlight one more time the importance of civic education, but as a first step, again, at least on our end, and as a civil society organization, we see it to first figure out who are actually civic educators and what do they do. And here are just three links if you wanted to find out more about any of the things I had just talked about.
Thank you so much for your presentation. If we had time, I could add some other aspects from the Hungarian NGO sector or civic sector, but now I ask our audience whether there's any question from the members of the audience. We have a few minutes for a Q&A, for a quick Q&A. I don't see anyone. If not, then Louisa, thank you. I don't know, Andre, very quickly, one question.
Well, I thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I had one question, basically, maybe more. There was a citizenship concept, but I think there is also citizenry concept. And I'm not sure it is the same for our presenter. Thank you.
Lisa?
Yeah.
So should I wait to gather more questions, or just go ahead and
go ahead, please? Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, obviously there is a difference, and as far as I'm concerned, the one is the kind of the legal status of being a citizen, whilst this citizenry is like the whole group. I haven't been making any difference in here.
Thank you. And in order to avoid any further delay, I would suggest to continue. And if in the meantime there's any other question, then just please drop into the Q&A chat box. And now let's continue with our next speaker, who is Zsolt Darvas, who joined Bruegel as a visiting fellow in September 2008, and where now he is a research senior fellow. He is also a senior research fellow at the Corvinus University of Budapest, from where he holds a PhD in economics, and where he teaches courses in econometrics, but also at other higher education institutions since 1994. His research interests include macroeconomics, international economics, central banking, and time series analysis. So just a personal aspect, those things which are very far from me. So I'm very curious about his presentation, which title is The Future of Sustainable Economic Development. And I will listen this presentation with the hope that I will also understand something and I will have a better insight of these economic aspects of the sustainable development. So Zsolt, the virtual floor is yours, and with the Q&A session, you have 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Eric, for the nice introduction. In fact, when I look at the program, I realize that there might not be many other economists in the group. So I try to structure my presentation and I prepared a couple of slides in a way which hopefully will be comprehensible for anyone who is not an economist. So let me share my.
Yeah, actually, sorry, just one. I would like to ask Louisa to make a host now, Zsolt or me, and then we can pass the chance to him. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So can you see my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I will talk about sustainable economic development, and let me briefly discuss three aspects of sustainability that I will discuss. Now, first of all, I will talk a lot about climate change and what does it mean for economic development. But certainly any climate change policy cannot be sustainable unless there is public support for such policies. So certainly economic development should be sustainable from a societal perspective. And thirdly, quite some climate policies are done by the government, the public sector. And as I will argue, there will be a need for quite some public investments. But that raises the question that already many countries have relatively high public debts. So how such public investment should be financed, leading to a sustainable fiscal position? That's a third aspect that I will discuss in my presentation. But first, I will show you a couple of slides about climate change. So this chart, which was taken from NASA, shows the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and as you can see on the horizontal axis, it is measured in thousands of years before today. So in fact, it's really going back to the past. And as you can see, in the past there are also some fluctuations in the CO2 concentration. But what you can see here is an arrow for 1950, quite right to the almost the end of the time scale, and also the more recent one, which is even much larger. So certainly, what is happening at the moment in the atmosphere is completely different than what was observed in previous centuries. And we already see, a couple of outcomes, which I will argue also related to climate change, such as heat wave, droughts, floods, and storms, and so on, which can have major impacts on many things like food productions, wildfire, water stress, and so on. And in turn, it can also influence how people are living. For example, if certain areas will completely dry up, then people simply move away from that. So there could be massive migration, that could be health issues and many different aspects. So clearly, climate change can influence how people living on our Earth. The next chart, also from NASA, is a bit more recent one, but it's also going back to 1.5 centuries. Namely, it shows how global temperature evolved in the past 140 years. And as you can see, compared to the pre-industrial level, there has indeed an increase in the temperature by about 1% above the pre-industrial level. And this is worrisome. Now, many people, in fact, there are still people, not many, a few. For example, I believe the previous US president was also such a people who doubt that climate change is an issue, and also doubt whether human behavior contributes to climate change. So the next chart, which might be a bit complicated because it altogether shows 5 times two panels, so altogether 10 charts. Nevertheless, what it does is that it shows many different indicators which all point to exactly the same direction. For example, the top left one is the land surface air temperature. There are 4 different data sets, and all show that I mean, the first observation is from 1850, so almost 200 years ago, and the most recent one is around a few years ago. It shows that in the past few decades there have been an increase. And the next one shows the sea surface air temperature. There are 5 different data sets, again all showing an increase in the past century. The next one is the marine air temperature, again going up, sea level going up, the summer Arctic Sea ice extent is going down in the past years, and I could continue. So there are indeed many different indicators which do indicate that climate is changing, and climate is changing now differently than in historical periods, and it's quite likely that human behavior has contributed to that. Now here I cite a recent report from IPCC, which stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In fact, the previous chart was also from this report, which is the United Nations scientific report on climate change. It was written by over 200 scientists who looked at more than 14,000 academic papers on climate change, and also discussed in a large number of workshops with many also government representatives and almost representatives for almost 200 countries approved the main conclusions of this report, which are briefly summarized here. So it says that if we continue the current policies that we are having now, then the global warming could reach to 1.5% over pre-industrial level by 2040. So in fact, much sooner than what the Paris Agreement hoped to achieve. And that could lead to, certainly, among many other things, more extreme weather events. But this is, you know, a kind of baseline scenario, and it can get much worse, and it can in fact continue. Again, with the current policies, the temperature rise will reach about 2 Celsius by 2060, and even more later. And if you also look at adverse feedback loops, feedback effects, which could release even more climate warming carbon emissions. For example, an example is also on the slide, like melting the Arctic permafrost or depleting global forests. Then, you know, the temperature rise could be even more than 4%, which is really significant. And the next table try to estimate the economic impact of that. And again, it's a little bit a big table. I apologize for that, but let me explain what you can see here. So first of all, you can see 4 data columns. The first data column, which has a green label, which says well below 2% increase, which is the Paris Climate Agreement target. So it shows one scenario when the temperature rise will be well below 2. Then we have 2 other scenarios in the middle, 2.0 and 2.6, which are more likely to happen considering current policies. And there's also a severe scenario over 3% on the right column. And what you can see here is that how much GDP, so gross domestic product, which is the most widely used indicator of economic activities, how it will deviate relative to a world where there was no climate change. And you can already see that even in the Paris well below 2% target, the world GDP would be more than 4% below of economic developments without climate change. But in the more adverse scenario, I mean, the range is going very, very large. I mean, 11% fall in the 2% scenario, almost 14% in the 2.6, and 18% in the 3.2 scenario. So clearly, I mean, the economic damage from climate change could be very, very significant. Now, this table also shows estimate across different regions of the world. I don't want to go through that. Just would like to highlight a very important phenomenon, namely that the impact on advanced countries is slightly less than in developing countries. For example, in OECD, in the Paris target, Paris scenario, the decline is 3.1%. In Europe, it's even lower, 2.8. But if you look at South America, it's -4. If you look at Asia, it's -5.5. So it's already indicate that across the world, I mean, the whole world would suffer, but poorer countries would suffer more than richer countries, which is a very specific concern. Now, the next chart shows where all these emissions are coming from. This is an excellent chart from the UK-based Our World in Data. And you can already see, if you just look at the circle, that almost 3/4 are coming from energy. And then you can see the components of energy. I mean, energy use in buildings is around 17%, transport 16%, energy use in industry 24%, and so on. But altogether, I mean, 3/4 of emissions are related to energy. So if we can make our energy system clean, then certainly we can make the biggest gains in harmful greenhouse gas emissions. Also, agriculture, forestry, and land use are also quite substantial, about 18%. Industry itself, if we disregard energy, is not that big, 5%, and also waste is not that big, 3%. So indeed, the big issue here is energy. The next chart, which also comes from the same data set, which is, I think, even more shocking as it shows just CO2 emissions by world regions. And you can see that in 1800 there was practically no or very little, and now, I mean, it's so huge. So it shows how much different regions of the world contributing. You can see the 27 European Union member in the bottom part of the chart, which in this bluish middle bluish color. And you can see that already, you know, in the past decades, emissions in Europe are going down, which is certainly a good news. And it also shows that Europe is not a really big player in total global emissions. I mean, the European Union. So it's about a bit over 10% Europe shares. The biggest emission from a single country is coming from China, followed by the United States. And also, I mean, some couple of other emerging countries are emitting quite a lot. Now, so what should we do? Basically, the issue is very simple. I mean, you also probably read I also read every day in the newspaper. So basically, we need to find a good balance between GHG is greenhouse gas emissions. So we should basically reduce emissions. This is the first action. And secondly, we should remove existing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and store them. Now, for the first one, as I already argued, the energy system has absolute priority in reaching that goal. And for the second, you know, for removing from the atmosphere, there are some natural carbon sinks like the soil or forests or oceans, and there are a lot of technological development of capturing and storing by human tools. This is developing, but not proper technologies are not yet available. I mean, let's hope that technological development will make such systems available in the future. So again, the simple thing is so far is simple thing. I mean, simply it's easy to say thing, I would say, is that we should reduce emissions and in particular energy. Now, the next chart shows how our energy is composed of now. and how it should be composed by 2050 if we want to reach the net zero target by then. I mean, this chart comes from the International Energy Agency recent report. Again, you can see in brown, coal in brown, you can see in red oil, and in this whatever color natural gas. As you can see, around this time in 2020, basically coal, oil, and natural gas accounts for about 80% of the total energy we are currently using. And certainly the share of these will have to go down to very, very low levels. And many other, I mean, as you can see, the largest gaining here are wind energy, solar energy, also bioenergy has to expand. Now, certainly this is just one scenario, but it already demonstrates that indeed there is a major need for shifting away from coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, what should we do? I mean, there are a couple of policy tools that we can do. I mean, certainly, in my view, also as an economist, I believe that carbon taxes should have the most prominent role in fostering a change. And the reason is very simple. If people can buy cheap energy, if industry can get cheap energy from coal or oil or from gas, then there will be no incentives to change. So it's only higher prices, higher carbon prices will make those incentives. But as I will argue, such taxes, also major limitations, and in particular can adversely impact the poorer segments of the society. So we can't just simply, raise carbon taxes to a high level and then assume that all the problems will be solved. Also, there's a major international coordination problem that even in the European Union, there is no agreement among member states on what level of carbon prices would be desirable. But even if Europe would come to an agreement for a drastic increase in carbon prices, many other countries would not follow, and that would lead to a major economic disadvantage for Europe if our industry has to pay for much higher carbon prices than, let's say, industries in China or US or elsewhere in the world. So that's certainly a complicated but a very important issue. Another one is emission standards. For example, any of one who are following car regulations, the emission regulations and standards on how much cars can emit are gradually tightened and tightened and tightened. For example, in Brussels, where I'm staying at the moment, from Brussels city, certain cars, certain diesel cars, highly emitting diesel cars are simply forbidden to enter the city. So again, people can't do as then, but sell those cars and buy newer ones. So standards, emission standards are also good. Good tools. Now, certainly subsidies. Again, if people get some support for insulating their houses, then they will be more willing to do than if they don't get. So there are a couple of policy tools, but none of them are simple. Now, turning to the European context, as my previous chart showed, the share of EU in global emissions is relatively modest. Nevertheless, I mean, there are two major issues why EU should do strong climate policies. First of all, also we should reach net zero also by 2050. So, and a lot has to be done by then. And second one, we should also be a leader of the world in doing that and encouraging other countries of the world. And also, since this event is about the transatlantic partnership, let me already indicate that with the new US administration, now there is a much greater chance of a transatlantic leadership on global climate change issues than before. Now, again, focusing on Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, most of the new investment has to be private. So, people changing their cars, from a highly emitting diesel car for a new electric car, for example, powered by clean electricity, then that has to be a private investment. But we also looked at, and I will cite some reports that it cannot be everything private, and also the public sector will have to do a lot. And again, our estimates in the EU suggest that it should be basically an immediate increase Okay, 2 minutes. An immediate increase in public investment in climate-related public investment by 1.5% of GDP annually, which is a very, very big amount. But at the same time, you know, what we noticed is that due to the COVID recession and also the big fiscal support that countries provided, many countries have much increased public debts and budget deficits. So they have to cut those back. But in the past, when countries started to consolidate, then those fiscal consolidation resulted in major cuts in public investment. And now, instead of cutting, you know, there will be a big need for increasing investment. Now, since I think I have only 1 minute left, I will skip some of the slides. But let me also talk about a little bit about social sustainability, and just use the example of higher carbon prices. Now, imagine that, you know, on road fuel, on gasoline and diesel fuel are increased very significantly. What kind of effects that can be on different segments of the society? Now, in green color, you can see the effects which doesn't impact inequality adversely, and with red you can see those which does. For example, the very poorest people who don't have a car at all, you know, they are not impacted at all by higher prices, so that's green. But on the other hand, for the rich one, you know, for the rich people typically spend just a small share of their total expenditure on gasoline, so it wouldn't hurt them that much. So it mostly would impact the middle class car owners, and again there are also rather differences, but there are also some other differences. For example, the rural-urban divide, because people living in the city are driving less than people living in the countryside. So again, countryside people would be impacted much more. Also, some poor households who need a car simply not be able to buy a more efficient one, while rich household can easily switch to expensive Tesla cars or whatever electric cars. Also, it would negatively affect jobs in the brown industry. That's also bad for social sustainability. I mean, it will also take some money away from the owners of such bad industries, brown industries, but that's a tip little. So again, my time is up. So basically, let me close here. I mean, just mention that we had a chance to write a paper for the Economic and Financial Ministers Council and presented it just 2 weeks ago in Slovenia, in which we discussed how to deal with the problem of the need for more public green investment, but at the same time also the need for the fiscal consolidation. And we discussed 3 options: a general relaxation of European Union fiscal rules, some form of green golden rule, which would give a special treatment to green investment, and the third one, a centralized EU capacity to fund green investment, possibly via EU borrowing. I don't have time to go into details, but at least I can say that I think these discussions will certainly continue, and there's a major need for green investments. The public sector have to play a major role in that, but we should be very, very careful that it will be also socially sustainable. And also it has to contribute to economic sustainability as well. So thank you very much, and let me stop now.
Thank you so much. Just very briefly to answer some questions from the chat box. We are happy to share all of the presentations of the speakers, obviously with the consent of the speakers. So we are happy to share it on our Facebook page, our web page, and we are happy to send it to all of you in mails. Because of the time frame, now there will be time just for one question, what we've got in the chat box, which is from Andre, that apart from Poland, is there any other EU country which is not concerned by the climate change and these all of these aspects what you've mentioned? And I would add another question from my side, that what is your opinion about the general view that when the countries will act together, then it would be too late?
So the first one is, I would say, a more political question, which countries don't see this problem urgently. But we can say that there is a kind of revealed opinion if you look at how large carbon taxes and different kind of emission taxes are in the EU. And generally, we see that those taxes are relatively low in many Central European countries, also including Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and a couple of countries. But on the contrary, such taxes are already quite high, let's say in Denmark, but also in Italy. So I think, and also in France, for example. So I see if we already look at how much taxes are put on emissions, I think that somehow reveals what the respective governments might think about the urgency of these problems. And I see here a East-West divide, unfortunately, whereby many Eastern countries might not regard this issue a priority, while many Western governments do regard it as a priority.
Thank you so much. And now, without any further delay and without any break, we will continue with Professor Hallin, who is a distinguished professor at the University of California's Department of Communication in San Diego. Mr. Hallin's research concerns journalism, political communication, and the comparative analysis of media systems. He has written on the media and war, including Vietnam, Central America, and the Gulf War. He has written on television coverage of elections, demonstrating the shrinking soundbite and offering an interpretation of its meaning for political journalism, and on the rise and decline of journalist professionalism in the United States. In recent years, he has turned his attention to the comparative analysis of media systems, focusing on Western Europe and Latin America, and trying to bring into political communication and media studies the tradition of comparative, historical, and institutional analysis that can be found in sociology and comparative politics. And the title of his presentation is The Future of Media Freedom, which is quite a current issue, not just on the other side of the Atlantic, but in Central and Eastern Europe and in Hungary as well. So we are very curious about your presentation, Professor Hallin. The virtual floor is yours for the next 30 minutes. Thank you for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much. Am I coming through okay? Okay, well, greetings to everybody. It's about 8 o'clock in the morning in San Diego. I'm sorry I haven't been able to join you, but of course it was, the time change makes it difficult. So at the end of the 20th century, at the time of the so-called Washington Consensus on neoliberalism and a wave of when most of the world was becoming integrated into a globalized market economy and a wave of democratization was occurring in many places, there was widespread optimism about a shift toward a strong global norm of media freedom. Today, we are clearly in a very different place, with media freedom seriously threatened, even in many places where it had either been historically strong or had emerged in ways that seemed very promising. The extent of the threat to press freedom varies substantially, of course. Hungary is among the more extreme cases, I would say, certainly for a country that is now part of the European Union, with the media largely captured by the state under a populist leader, a pattern similar to what you find in Turkey under Erdogan or Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. In the United States, we have, of course, seen elements of this same pattern, with Trump, like many populist leaders, denouncing the media as an enemy of the people, mobilizing hatred and mistrust of journalists, and often threatening to use state power against media organizations. Trump was never as skilled a politician as Orban or Erdogan or Chavez or Modi. However, Trump never had majority support, and I would say didn't even really seem to appreciate the importance of building a majority. The most dangerous populists are those who have strong majorities. And of course, democracy and press freedom have deep roots in the United States, and the institutional barriers to monopolization of political power, the so-called checks and balances, remain strong. So despite initial predictions that the so-called mainstream media, those historically dominated by professional journalism, would become irrelevant with Trump's victory, pushed aside by social media and populist partisan media, in fact, the central players of mainstream media, Washington Post, New York Times, CNN, and the television networks, remained strong and aggressive through Trump's presidency, both in terms of audience and in terms of their centrality to the flow of information. Still, media freedom in the United States does face real threat. This threat is most tangible today at a very decentralized level in the form of mob violence and harassment of journalists, for example, often carried out by crowds at right-wing rallies, and by local police as well. And more generally, the decline of social consensus on the credibility of journalism, the growth of hostility to media institutions, and the rise of the post-truth culture that sees information purely as a weapon of political struggle. All of these are profound cultural changes that certainly undercut the foundation that sustains press freedom. This pattern of increasing harassment and violence against journalists is familiar in many places traditionally known for strong traditions of press freedom, including much of Western Europe. I would like to make three main points today about the current crisis of media freedom. The first is that the causes of this crisis and the kinds of forces that threaten media freedom are diverse, and we have to understand the issue in its different contexts in different parts of the world. I'm a comparativist, so when I approach media freedom, I definitely approach it as a comparativist with an emphasis on context. The second point is that this crisis is in most places rooted in a broader crisis of democracy and liberalism and cannot be understood apart from that broader crisis. It's not just a problem of media freedom, it is a problem of democracy more generally. And finally, coming back to the idea of post-truth culture, I want to argue that the crisis of media freedom is connected with a more general set of issues about dialogue, consensus, and truth, and the role that the media play in facilitating or undermining the social processes that produce a healthy public sphere. So issues of media freedom, in other words, are often inseparable from issues of media openness and accountability and sustainability. I will focus primarily on the cases of the United States and also Latin America, which is a region that I study in detail and which I think is interesting to compare with other regions. So I'll make some reference to other regions. So first of all, threats to media freedom and their context. The most traditional way of understanding threats to press freedom centers on the role of the state and the imposition of state control over media, which are assumed to have been previously independent. And of course, many cases look a lot like this. Hungary presumably would be one, a case where a particular political actor was able to consolidate political power to the extent that it gave him a platform to capture or intimidate media and journalism. But there's lots of other contexts around the world where the problems of press freedom look different or more complex. In Mexico, to take a clearly contrasting case that I've studied, a substantial deterioration in media freedom took place after a very promising opening in the period when Mexico moved from being a one-party dominant regime to a competitive political regime. But this deterioration in media freedom took place primarily because of the growth of violent threats by organized crime and the ability of the latter to penetrate the state and capture it for its own ends. It reflects, therefore, in an important sense, not the strength of the state, but its weakness, its inability to exercise a monopoly over the use of force and to counter impunity. In other parts of Latin America, press freedom is indeed often threatened by the exercise of state power. But more typically, I would say in Latin America, the relation of the media to the state is one of collusion. Both are controlled essentially by the same relatively narrow set of elites. Politicians use state power and resources to support the media, and media owners and many elite journalists support and also sometimes bargain with those politicians. Much of the focus of this conference, I think, is of course on populism. So I'd like to give a little bit of perspective on populism and media freedom from the Latin American perspective, where, of course, unlike Europe and cases like Turkey or India, populism is more typically on the left politically than on the right. Populist governments in Latin America typically denounce media as part of the corrupt elite, with more justification in Latin America than in many other parts of the world. In many cases, populist governments on the left ally with media reform movements, often called media accountability movements in the region, which have proliferated with the spread of democracy. These movements have advocated strongly for media freedom, for example, for access to official information and an end to impunity for violence against journalists, but they have at the same time advocated for regulatory interventions to democratize oligarchic media systems. Populist leaders have often taken up these demands and acted to challenge existing media powers, passing laws to regulate media in various ways, and also establishing state-funded media and encouraging the growth of community media, which are primary demands of those media accountability movements. Media elites have typically denounced these policies as threat to press freedom, and global press freedom advocacy organizations have often echoed this. But the reality is often somewhat more complex. Threats to press freedom in these cases are definitely real. Populist leaders in Latin America see media as crucial to the consolidation of power. They also see themselves as the embodiment of popular sovereignty and reject political checks and balances in general as anti-democratic. And the reforms they carry out, appropriated in a sense from grassroots media accountability movements, are often radical at a certain level, challenging the structure of the media system as media accountability movements have advocated. But in other ways, populist leaders implement reforms in media policies in ways that are, one could say, conservative in the sense that they simply reproduce traditional patterns of clientelism and patrimonialism and fail in the end to promote the growth of independent media. Most of these populist leaders in the Latin American case on the left do not in the end consolidate control over the media. Chavez was the exception in the latest wave of left-wing populist rule. Instead, what happens is that media become polarized between pro and anti-populist media, both of them highly politicized. Damage to press freedom is often inflicted during these conflicts. At the same time, pluralism in the media system increases, and research by a graduate student of mine, Manuel Palos Pons, on the case of Ecuador, shows that in surprising ways, journalistic professionalism may actually increase as well, as media find themselves subject to increased scrutiny and have to worry about sources, for example, or ethnic stereotypes in ways they did not before. Eventually, the populist leader loses power, media-state relations shift from conflict back to collusion, complaints of threats to press freedom decline, but so too does pluralism in the media system. Historian James Kane, who writes about the classic case of populist leadership under Juan Perón in Argentina, criticizes the narrative of, quote, a sudden authoritarian intromission into the otherwise progressive development of an internally coherent autonomous press. And I think he is right about Latin America and probably many other parts of the world as well, where the barriers to media autonomy and the openness of public sphere here are deep and long-standing and persist as populist regimes come and go. Second point I'd like to make, probably much more briefly than I should, but just to touch on it, has to do with the crisis of democracy. And here what I would say is that the growth of threats to media freedom is not an isolated phenomenon, but must be understood in the context of a broader crisis of democracy and liberalism, which undermines the cultural and institutional basis within which media freedom has traditionally been able to thrive. This too, of course, takes different forms in different parts of the world. In Latin America, for example, and I think probably in many other parts of the world, the persistence of corruption is an important factor which undermines public support for democracy and also creates incentive for elites to undermine media freedom. One thing that I think is common to much of the democratic world, experienced in different ways, but very fundamental to understanding what is going on today, is the persistence or even intensification of inequality, which leaves much of the population feeling that the liberal democratic order does not deliver results that improve their lives. These and other factors, including probably the shift from politics based in economic interests to politics based in identity, have produced an increase in political polarization, which has profound consequences, undermining both the ability of democratic governments to take action to solve problems and support for the norms of political debate and contestation. In the case of my own country, this change is truly profound, though we will have to see to what extent it proves a lasting change and to what extent it is tied to the figure of Trump and will pass away as he leaves the scene. But the fact that Trump was willing to break the norms of accepting the results of a democratic election, and that his party was willing, rhetorically at least, to back him on it, is a symbol of a profound rupture in political culture. And the context of polarization in which it occurs is obviously at the root of the kinds of attacks on media freedom that have taken place increasingly during the Trump era. One of the effects of polarization is that it makes the practice of so-called objective journalism, which was a key mechanism by which journalists in the United States were able to present themselves as an institution above political divisions, serving society as a whole. It makes those practices increasingly difficult to sustain. Polarization also increases the stakes of politics, and by doing so, increases the incentive to attack and seek to control media. And at the global level, if liberal democracies appear unstable, as the United States certainly did in the wake of the 2020 election, if they are unable to reach consensus on resolving social problems, from inequality to the pandemic, if their communication systems are unable to manage the circulation of misinformation and hate speech, they do not appear as very attractive models. And competing models of political and media organization, the Chinese being the most coherent, become more attractive, with obvious consequences for the value of media freedom. The final point that I want to make has to do with the crisis of truth. And here I would say that if there is a crisis in our system of public communication, in our ability as societies to separate truth from falsehood, to have open and inclusive exchange of views on public issues, and to reach the consensus necessary to take action on common problems, it is not a crisis certainly that can be attributed solely to issues of media freedom. Media freedom may be central to this problem in some countries. I think that would probably be true of Hungary, or even in a more extreme form of Russia. In other places, its role is less central. Threats to media freedom are more likely to be part of the long-term damage caused by the crisis than the central cause of the crisis itself. In many cases, moreover, media are themselves part of the problem. One of the most important reflections on media freedom in the history of the United States is the so-called Hutchins Report, the report of the Commission on Freedom of the Press, sponsored by Time Life publisher Henry Luce. Published in another period of crisis in the wake of the Great Depression and the Second World War, it explored broad issues related to inequality and access to the means of communication and the spread of propaganda and misinformation, and made a fairly strong statement that, quote, the failure of the press is the greatest danger to its freedom. The report discusses the possibility of various forms of public policy intervention to resolve issues of the quality of public communication, but reflecting the dominance of liberal ideology in the US, falls back on professionalization of the media as the solution. Similar issues can be raised today in a period when that professionalization solution is breaking down in many ways. The media accountability movements of Latin America I mentioned earlier articulate a version of this view. In the US context, it is certainly clear that the spread of misinformation, the polarization of political discourse, and the breakdown of social solidarity and of norms of political competition, all to a significant extent are influenced by the actions of media organizations. The discourse of journalists as an enemy of the people, for one thing, is not something that originated with the state. It is something that arose inside the media, in talk radio initially, and then at Fox News and in other right-wing online media, as they worked to differentiate themselves from so-called mainstream media and build audience niches on the basis of political and cultural identity. Indeed, a strong case can be made that the principal actor in the rise of Trump and the shift of the Republican Party to right-wing populism was Fox News. Fox and other right-wing media have also played a central role in the circulation of misinformation about voter fraud in the 2020 election, and in the politicization of the public response to the coronavirus and the circulation of misinformation about it. Over a longer period, Fox and Rupert Murdoch's media properties more generally have played an important role in holding back the development of consensus on the reality of climate change, an issue recently in the news following the agreement of Murdoch Media in Australia to move away from climate denial. The role of Fox probably represents a more extreme case of centralized spread of misinformation, promotion of political division, and undermining of democratic norms than anything that took place in the United States in the era when the Hutchins Commission report was written. It is a piece and a prime example of a wider phenomenon that involved changed institutional structures, the decline, for example, of centralized media gatekeepers, and of a deep cultural shift toward what is often called post-truth culture, a culture, I should wrap up, okay, a culture in which people are increasingly cynical about the possibility of any generally agreed criteria of truth. And information is evaluated for its relation to people's identities and interests. And I would say that obviously another central piece of this is the rise of social media. And I'll just stop here by saying, I mean, everybody knows some of the elements of this, but social media are particularly complex from the point of view of thinking about media freedom issues, because they are a form of communication that has never really existed before. That is a peer-to-peer network that in some ways is like a telecommunication system, like the telephone network, and simultaneously a means of mass communication that we normally evaluate by other kinds of criteria involving public interest accountability. So it's very difficult to think through how to conceptualize social media from the point of view of media freedom. And I'll stop there and happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, and sorry for the interruption, but we had some questions, and I was thinking that maybe we can provide some space for the questions. And first in the row, it was István Hegedűs from the Hungarian Europe Society. So István, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dan, for this fantastic presentation, and it's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to our event and conference. Let me ask you briefly about your view regarding your famous book together with Pablo Mancini about media systems. And then I remember one sentence maybe written by Mancini and not yourself, that partisan journalism is actually not so bad, something like that. He argued that the traditional model of neutral, objective journalism of the Anglo-Saxon model can be also supplemented by other models where partisanship can bring in what you also mentioned today, some new ideas and maybe competition. My problem is regarding the future of liberal democracies. In case the state, as you said, I would say the government in the case of Hungary actually changed the media landscape and had a strong intervention supporting and creating new sort of media landscape, supporting right-wing or even extreme right-wing media outlets, changing totally the opportunities and oppressing free part, what we call today the free part of the media sector in Hungary. Can we still talk about any sort of competition and a sort of evolvement of journalism standards when we only have a totally polarized media landscape, and instead of changing and making journalism standards better, we have a sort of propaganda campaign in many cases, and not a really free press as we would hope from partisan, healthy competition maybe. So what would be your reaction to that problem?
Yeah, so, I agree with Mancini that partisanship is not bad in itself, right? And one of the complaints that media critics have traditionally had in the United States has to do with lack of diversity in the media, right? The fact that for a long, long time, we had all media that basically had the same place in the political spectrum, in the center, more or less, right? But we didn't have kind of diversity. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting, healthy debate going on in the US about norms of objectivity and how they need to change, and how journalists need to be more open about their values and so on. But I think that for a system with partisan media, so-called external pluralism, for it to work, there have to be norms, right? There have to be rules of the game. There have to be ethical norms of journalism itself, which I think, you found in much of Western Europe for much of the late 20th century was a combination of media partisanship with fairly strong professional norms. And there also have to be norms in the political system. So as I was saying, I think the problem is not just a problem of media, but it's also a problem of the political system. So when you have the kind of intense partisanship that's starting to develop in the United States, and a kind of partisanship where there are not norms of the, like respect for the democratic process, and there are also not norms of like serving the public and solving its problems, then I think the system really breaks down. And so this is the danger of this post-truth culture that I wanted to point to.
In the chat box, we've got a question, rather a comment, so I would like to share it with you, and we are curious about your opinions. So Andre has written us that we are having populists in power for quite a long time, for decades, and there was just limited case of collusion between media and populists. And his question is that, what does it say about the power of the media? What is your opinion about it?
Yeah, I won't comment on the Hungarian case because I don't know the whole history of what for example, what role the media played in the rise of Orban and how they were reoriented. In the US case, of course, my argument is that it's the media that created populism above all, not exclusively, but okay, they were the central players and they really created Trump. And Trump's appeal is one that originated in the in the media. And it's something you see in other places too, like with Murdoch media in Britain. I think that they're at the basis of right-wing populism in Britain as well. And this is one of the key arguments that I make in many contexts, including the Latin American context, about the sort of traditional view of press freedom is that you understand media as being these independent, kind of professionalized providers of information on the one hand, and then the state as a political actor on the other, and then you want to make sure that the state doesn't interfere. But in many cases, media are political actors too, right? They're both political actors. And so the way that you understand media freedom has to take that into account. And our policy interventions and the kind of discourse that we put forward about how these solve these problems has to take into account the role of the media as political actors and how to deal with it. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why we don't see these problems in many parts of Western Europe, I would say, is because of public service broadcasting, which has remained a strong institution and manages to provide a kind of a stable basis for the formation of public opinion that we don't have in the United States, and that you don't have in Latin America, and that you don't have in Hungary in that way. So those kinds of institutional arrangements are a counter, among other things, to this bad form of partisan media, as well as to state manipulation of media and public opinion.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us today, despite the early hours in the United States. So thank you so much. Okay. And just before the continuation, let me remind all of you that you can read a written contribution, a publication, a short paper from Professor Hallin as well in our upcoming publication. Thank you so much, and let's continue with the last presentation in this blog before a short break with Naja Bentzen, who is a policy analyst at the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington, D.C., and a fellow of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Her experience includes international relations with a special focus on the European Union, the Eastern neighborhood, and the Arctic, disinformation and foreign interference, media analysis, and journalism. She has studied or worked in Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, and now in the United States. So very good early morning. And the title of her presentation is The Future of Truth and Facts. So actually, I think this presentation connects the third part of Professor Hallin's speech. So the virtual floor is yours for the next half an hour.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you very much for organizing this brilliant event, and to Istvan for inviting me. It's a great honor to participate in this very useful and very topical discussion. The level of discussion is really impressive, I think, including the presentations by my fellow panelists. And what I say, I have to start with a disclaimer saying that what I say today is my personal opinion. It's not the official position of the European Parliament, my employer. So now I can start by making a very bold statement and say that the futures that we are discussing today are all interconnected, as Petra Barth also alluded to. The future of media freedom that Daniel Hallin talked about, the future of the rule of law, the future of liberal democracy, they are interconnected and they hinge on the future of truth and facts. And in that sense, I'll precisely pick up where Daniel Hallin left off, as Eric also mentioned. So I look at both the dark side and then the bright side. Looking at the gloomy side first, I'll give you some recent examples of current evolving consequences of the rampant truth decay or post-truth culture that we are witnessing at the moment. And that actually are linked to some of the previous presentations. And that will serve as the basis for the second and hopefully brighter part, where I'll mention some of the tools that we could use to strengthen our knowledge and information supply chains on the long term, in the long term, on both sides of the Atlantic. And I very deliberately say strengthen, not create, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can, and I think we should, try to strengthen tools that we already have, because truth and trust are two sides of the same coin. You cannot communicate facts to people if they don't trust the source. And it's not necessarily useful, I think, to bombard people with new sources at a time when most of us are suffering from acute information overload. But before I come to the examples, just a little bit of context. First, I want to highlight that I think all of us in this virtual room are privileged in the sense that we all have access to expensive and specialized information sources through our work. I think we all speak at least one foreign language well enough to use it as a working language. And I'd like to kindly ask you to try to put yourself into the shoes of people who are not that privileged, of people who rely on social media for news and on Google when they try to look up facts, people who have limited access to reliable sources of knowledge, which makes them easier to manipulate. And then to a little bit more background, political scientist Thomas Reid has identified 4 waves of modern era disinformation. The first wave in the interwar years, where popular print journalism and radio amplified disinformation linked with the Bolshevik revolution. World War II sparked a second wave of disinformation fueled by tension between the West and the East. The third wave began in the late 1970s when disinformation was, as Reid says, lifted to an operational science of global proportion. And then the fourth wave that has emerged over the past decade with disinformation reborn and reshaped by new technologies and internet culture. And the effects of information manipulation and the actors behind go beyond the geostrategic realm. In 2018, researchers from the US RAND Corporation used the notion of truth decay to capture 4 related trends. And that goes back to what Daniel Hallin was talking about, post-truth. They named the following trends: growing disagreement about facts. Secondly, blurred lines between opinion and fact. Thirdly, increasing influence of opinion over fact. And fourthly, declining trust in formally respected sources of factual information. And since the report on truth decay was published, we have seen a number of examples of the consequences and a number of new players who traffic in and benefit from truth decay have been added to the mix of actors. We've seen that, of course, authoritarian state actors have stepped up their information attacks on open democracies. That is to be expected, of course, especially at a time when their own handling of, for example, the pandemic is under scrutiny. Secondly, at the same time, economic incentives to use information manipulation have added to the pressure on the global information space. In addition, the dividing lines between foreign and domestic actors engaging in information manipulations are increasingly blurred. This is something we have seen very recently in the US, for example. And the lines between political and economic incentives for manipulating information are also increasingly blurred. So we have authoritarian state actors like Russia and China, who have geostrategic interests in undermining open democracies and who wage, as Jonathan Rauch has called it, epistemic warfare, a war on our fact and truth-based system. They have their own content mills that are highly specialized in churning out disinformation. And in addition to the usual suspects, a number of commercial players have become more visibly involved in information manipulation. It's a fast-growing business for various private companies. In a report from 2020, the Oxford Internet Institute found that private companies increasingly use computational propaganda. The researchers identified 48 countries where private companies were managing information manipulation campaigns. The number of countries where this was found had increased from just 9 in 2017. The report also found that almost $60 million has been spent on firms who use bots and other amplification strategies to create the impression of trending political messaging. And because there are expectations that a growing number of private companies will turn to such services, some experts predict that there will be a growing competition between actors that offer disinformation as a service. That takes me to the examples that I promised you just before. A recent report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute showed coordinated campaigns in Indonesia attacking BBC reporting, alleging that fires had deliberately been lit to clear forests for palm oil production. Many of the accounts that attacked BBC's reporting not only tweeted about palm oil, but also promoted e-commerce sites owned by a Chinese company. So the global reputation of the palm oil industry is a concern for both Indonesia and Malaysia, because these two countries dominate the global palm oil production. And Indonesia and Malaysia have indicated that they intend to lobby to counter palm oil critics in Europe. Another example, which ties into a previous presentation, is the oil industry, which is right now facing a wave of lawsuits in the US, accusing oil and gas companies of engaging in multi-million-dollar, decades-long campaigns to deliberately downplay warnings from their own scientists about the effects burning fossil fuels has on the climate. The US House Oversight Committee has called executives from Exxon, Shell, BP, and other companies to testify in Congress after a secret recording earlier this year showed an Exxon official boasting about these information manipulation campaigns. It has used a think tank for hire, the Heartland Institute, to discredit the scientific consensus on climate change, just like the same think tank has worked with a major tobacco company to discredit warnings about the risks of secondhand smoke and to lobby against smoking bans. So we are also seeing links between political and economic incentives in undermining trust in health advice, with the US website InfoWars, Alex Jones peddling conspiracy theories, including about vaccines, and at the same time pushing his own vitamin products that he claims can boost your immune system to help the body fight COVID-19 in a natural way, he claims. So we've also seen the repercussions of the continuous lies spread by former President Trump about alleged voter fraud, physical consequences in the form of mob violence, such as the attack on the US Capitol on January 6th, and in surveys showing that 78% of Republicans say that Biden did not win the election, and 54% believe that there is solid evidence of that. Trump himself has used these claims to collect millions of dollars from his supporters, and the Trump-backed so-called election audit in Arizona, again based on the big lie of election fraud, has served both to undermine trust in democracy and at the same time appears to be a lucrative business that can be rolled out in other states. Again, this is a gray zone between political and economic incentives. So if we move on to an example of corporate information manipulation by information gatekeepers themselves, Facebook's new initiative called Project Amplify aims to push pro-Facebook news items, some of which are written by Facebook itself, on the news feed of the users to improve its own reputation and regain control of its narrative after a number of scandals in recent years. And the last completely different example of what we very broadly can characterize as anti-enlightenment efforts. Recent research has shown that automated student cheating, where a digital business specialized in finding answers to academic questions posed by students, saw a surge of almost 200% in the number of questions submitted to this service between 2019 and 2020, mainly because of the increase in exams being held remotely. And this particular company also offers other services such as plagiarism detection to allow users to prevent getting caught themselves by the university's plagiarism detection tools. So the consequence here is not only that people are cheating, which is bad enough, or that a culture of cheating is being normalized, or even encouraged, which is also very bad. It's yet another layer in the booming anti-enlightenment industry. And a very concrete consequence is that investors are more attracted to the cheating service than the textbook publisher whose content the cheating service is piggybacking on. And last year, the cheating service surpassed the market value of the textbook publisher. So we have reached a point where anti-enlightenment is better business than providing knowledge. So in other words, very bluntly put, it's more lucrative to flood the zone with junk, as former Trump advisor Steve Bannon put it, than it is to be a force for enlightenment and what we could call Bildung 2.0. And the examples that we have seen show how lies and cheating spill over into all areas of life and erode our decision-making processes, both individually, collectively, and policy-wise. So you may have noticed that I left out the latest efforts by Kremlin-sponsored disinformants and efforts by the Chinese Communist Party to undermine trust in our democratic institutions and processes. And that is, of course, part of the big picture. And I recommend the reports by, for example, the Alliance for Securing Democracy on this, including on the recent German elections. I also recommend following the work of the Stratcom task forces under the European External Action Service, who maintain the most complete archive documenting state-sponsored pro-Kremlin disinformation in Europe. If you have access to BBC monitoring, that's another excellent source. And I also want to mention the important mandate and work of the European Parliament's Special Committee on Foreign Interference, including disinformation, which is very busy right now looking into various aspects of these complex challenges. So stay tuned for their recommendations. So I know I might have depressed you by mentioning just a few recent examples of truth decay and the consequences. So coming from the dark side, let's look at the other side, the brighter side, the enlightened side, and what we can call the knowledge and information supply chain. There are encouraging developments showing that we can counter information manipulation. Sites that publish false content have seen their engagement drop at much higher rates than US-based sites in general, probably as a result of account takedowns and changes in these platforms' policies. But still, we can't leave it to private platforms that are addicted to growth to defend our collective cognitive resilience. And this is where cooperation between democracies come in. We are obviously in this together as democracies, but it also has to be said that even though we might be in the same global storm, in practice, we're not in the same boat. Some countries have significantly more impact than others. Some have more resilient democracies than others, and those with the most impact and the most resources have to find a compass that can help us all weather the global storm. There is a lot of work going on currently in both the EU and in the US on the tech regulation front, looking at how to tackle digital services, digital markets. The EU-US Trade and Technology Council will kick off in Pittsburgh the day after tomorrow will address how we can form strategic alliances to overcome differences and difficulties in this respect. And that includes, of course, the role and responsibilities of the major online platforms that distribute content. But the distribution is, of course, only one layer of the fabric of shared realities that tie us together. There are increasing calls from media experts and scholars for sustainable civic digital information infrastructures. Karen Kornblue and Ellen Goodman from the German Marshall Fund have proposed what they call a PBS of the internet that connects public media resources and other civic content providers. Similarly, Ethan Zuckerman, another scholar who is working in this field, advocates for digital public infrastructures. Other experts have also called for reinventing the digital public squares that are currently hosted in commercial private platforms that are, as I said, addicted to growth via user attention. And there are many different ideas for reimagining online platforms as the digital version of public parks and public libraries. And it's of course absolutely crucial that they are non-commercial, of course, and it's just as crucial that they are not captured by the state. So while the work on constructing these digital public squares or digital civic spaces continues, we can already strengthen some of the civic non-commercial content providers that can form a key layer in this digital public infrastructure. Some components, for example, reliable quality local media as well as independent public broadcasters are often mentioned. Some have already been mentioned today. They're crucial in terms of contributing to shared fact-based realities. Another tool that already exists in a number of language communities are verified online encyclopedias. And I'm not talking about Wikipedia, which is a great success story in many respects. It's the only non-commercial website among the 50 most popular websites in the world, which shows that there is enormous demand for this type of service. But Wikipedia also has its flaws. It's vulnerable to edit wars, for example, and at the same time, the number of and the quality of articles available vary a lot in the different language versions. So verified online encyclopedias ideally provide access to knowledge about society, history, culture, religion, biology, geography, climate, knowledge that is important for people's ability to form their opinion, which is a key aspect of freedom of expression. And access to reliable knowledge makes it easier for people to check facts themselves beyond the news and help them to understand the big picture. And the findability of this type of content, as the EU underlined in its communication on online disinformation in 2018, can be facilitated by online platforms, but the availability and the very existence of reliable sources for general interest knowledge, for example, national online encyclopedias, remains very, very patchy. Some of them have very deep roots, making them well-known knowledge brands that users recognize and trust. And one example is Encyclopedia Britannica, which has been published in the United States since 1901 and is the world's leading and best known private general knowledge English language and online encyclopedia. Britannica has a paywall, so without paying, users can only access a certain part of the content. In some countries, for example, in Norway and in Denmark, the national online encyclopedias are non-profit. They're well-known and trusted knowledge brand that provide access free of charge and are heavily used by students, for example. So in both countries, the Encyclopedia Association is co-owned by academic institutions, including the country's universities. They encourage user participation, meaning that users can suggest content and changes and become engaged in the knowledge sharing community, but they cannot edit the articles directly. At the other end of the scale, Turkey currently has no national online encyclopedia. And if we look at the role of encyclopedias in authoritarian states, I think it's telling that these tools are taken very seriously. China had 20,000 people working on a national government-funded encyclopedia that has been called, that they call themselves the Great Wall of Culture. Russia put up its updated Great Russian Encyclopedia online in 2016, and the editor calls it the Territory of Truth. So there is a significant vacuum in some countries that I hope that we can fill ourselves before someone else does, who might have an anti-enlightenment agenda. And just to wrap up, in uncertain times, we need public anchors of knowledge. The future of democracy hinges on the future of shared realities based on shared truth and shared facts. And if we are able to build sustainable, resilient, interconnected knowledge and information supply chains, they would be forces for enlightenment and Bildung 2.0, not only for citizens in open democracies, but potentially also in the long term for citizens in authoritarian states. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much. And we have some questions. So let's continue immediately with the questions. One was arriving from György Kocsis, who is member of the Hungarian Europe Society and the journalist of the Hungarian weekly HVG. And she asks, can you imagine the creation of national and/or international rating agencies which would rate media outlets according to their credibility, just like those which rate universities or international bonds? If you don't mind, I would like to add my question as well, and then István has a question as well, and then you can react together to these three. My question would be that some of the solutions what you mentioned could have some effect on middle or long term, but the problem is right now and right here, for example, related to the infodemics, that there are millions of people, for example, who don't want to get the vaccine, and it can cause a lot of problems, like overwhelming the healthcare system or prolong the epidemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So what is your idea? What is your solution for the current situation right now, right here, in order to fight against the mis or disinformation? And István has another question, so go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. I did not formulate it in written form. Sorry for that, trying to be short. First, I have actually two short questions. The first is, what do you think, Naja, about the role of spin doctors in politics who were famous, giving a spin to facts? Is there any responsibility of democratic political players, what we face today regarding non-facts and untruth? My second question is still about Russia and China, and it was great that the big picture you gave us show that it's not only about Russia and China, but their influence on liberal democracies. It's still a problem. My question is, do you think that we have found anything how to defend ourselves from their intervention in recent years?
Naja,
please answer.
Yes.
Briefly,
yes,
the questions.
yes.
I know it's challenging, but
it is very challenging. Great questions, many things. So firstly, there are already examples of rating services which are not exactly agencies that rate news quality, news outlets, and they rate the reliability. So, for example, NewsGuard, I can just post the link in the chat, just here. They help. They say they help you decide which news sources to trust with ratings from humans, not algorithms, and they are independent and have trust ratings for over 6,000 websites produced by real journalists. So that's the short answer. The second question related to the here and now, the response to the rampant vaccine misinformation and disinformation. There are communication experts from WHO and governments all over the world working frantically to find a solution to this problem. If I had a quick fix, then I would probably be awarded the Nobel Prize. So I don't have a silver bullet for that. Then there was a question from Istvan regarding the spin doctors and their responsibility. I absolutely agree that they carry an enormous responsibility for spinning the facts and for also undermining public trust in politicians. So that's also the very short answer to that question. And that, I think, yeah. Is that enough?
Yeah, I think so, especially if we have to take into consideration the time framing and the time. After your presentation or during your presentation, just an old memory came into my mind. Once I've heard from a flight attendant that the weather is at our destination. If you are optimistic, partially sunny. If you are pessimistic, partially cloudy. So I think this is the situation related to the truth and facts as well. Please.
Sorry, I just forgot the very last question by Istvan. You said have we learned anything that we can actually use to counter the disinformation by Russia and China? We are learning all the time. We are in a very steep learning on a very steep learning curve. I think that first of all, we are much better at analyzing and also forecasting in a way the different narratives that we are bombarded with. And I think that the EU versus disinfo that I mentioned before, they're doing a fantastic job of doing just that. And I can also post a link in the chat in a second. Secondly, which we saw just, I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, the Commission calling out the Kremlin's interference in the German elections. I think that is also definitely a positive step in the right direction that we call them out. So yes, we have learned something. We are still on a very steep learning curve, but it will always be more difficult to counter disinformation than it is to produce it, and that's also why I think we have to strengthen the knowledge supply chains, because these knowledge supply chains can actually also go in the other direction and enlighten their citizens, and that will be, of course, not in their interest but in our interest.
Thank you so much. And we will continue our learning curve with 3 distinguished speakers from the United States, from East and West Coast as well, but just after a 15 minutes break. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. And then we will continue in 15 minutes, and I will pass back the moderator role to István. So see you everybody at 5:15 Central European time. Thank you.
6:15 actually.
6:15, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.